Gordon. As soon as Ralph gets seated, we can get started. All right, good morning.
Good morning, Warner.
Do you see the 13 in the upper right?
This is the...
There are 13 lessons in the quarter, and we're at 13. What does that indicate? We're at the end. So next week, there will be a new class, and our last slide will say what that new class is, if you don't know already. All right. Gordon, you don't know?
Yeah.
Okay. Gordon doesn't know what it is, but he's going to teach the first two classes. All right. Yeah.
It'll be by inspiration.
Yeah. I remember one person beginning sermon got up and read the scripture passage. The minister got up and he says, I want you to know that's a wonderful passage. Has nothing to do with the lesson today, but that was a wonderful passage. All right. So the day finishes out Sacred Gifts and Holy Gatherings, the Feast of Booths. So we're going to be feasting February 26th. Okay, the month of February we've been doing the Holy Gatherings, the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Weeks. We know that better as Pentecost. And then there was the Day of Atonement, the one day of the year when atonement is made for the sins of the people. That's those sins that weren't accounted for when they did their own offerings. And then today is the Feast of Booths. And here's our calendar. The first one was Passover up here in the springtime. And then we had Pentecost and then Tabernacles here. And it's called Sukkot, which means, in Hebrew, which means booths. And this year it'll be celebrated 29 September through 6 October. And that's the last of the three feasts that the Lord requires the Israelites to come to the place that he named to celebrate a feast unto him. And that place that he named would be Jerusalem. So here's sort of our theme verse here. Leviticus 23, 42, 43. You shall dwell in booths for 7 days. All native Israelites shall dwell in booths, that your generations may know that I made the people of Israel dwell in booths when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Okay, so this commemorates their living arrangements when they came out of Egypt. Of course, when they were living in the land of Goshen, they'd been there, Scripture says, for 430 years. So they had houses there to live. Of course, when they left the land, they went out to the wilderness and they needed some covering, a place to live. So they lived in tents during that time period when they were out there. It turned out to be 40 years. Didn't have to be 40 years, but due to their disobedience, it turned out to be 40 years. So here's the passage, 23. It's 11 verses here in this, but we'll be getting into some other areas. And the Lord spoke to Moses. This is one of 33 times in the book of Leviticus where the Lord speaks to Moses. We mentioned last week that Leviticus has the most sayings, the most direct dialogue of the Lord speaking. But he speaks to Moses 33 times in the book of Leviticus, but that's not the record. Numbers, 42 times. So what did he say? He tells Moses is the intermediary. So the Lord speaks to Moses, and Moses speaks to the people. So speak to the people of Israel, saying, on the 15th day of this 7th month, and for 7 days is the Feast of Booths. Elsewhere, sometimes called Feast of Tabernacles, but in verse 16 of this chapter, it's called the Feast of Ingathering because it commemorates gathering in all the crops. This is the last crop of the year, and then you can have all your stuff stored and then wait for the next year. On the first day shall be a holy convocation. You shall not do any ordinary work. Well, what is ordinary work? That's your vocation. If you're a tent maker like Saul of Tarsus, you don't make tents. If you're a baker, you don't bake. Things like that. For 7 days you shall present food offerings to the Lord. On the 8th day you shall hold a holy convocation and present a food offering to the Lord. It is a solemn assembly. You shall not do any ordinary work. Now, does it sound like Moses is repeating himself a lot here?
He does.
He does. In Hebrew writing, if something was important, you repeat it. They didn't have italics, they didn't have bold print, they didn't have any of that stuff, so they would repeat it. And just in these few verses here, 33 through 36, we see 7 days. This is for 7 days. 7 days. It's a holy convocation. It's a holy convocation. Don't do any ordinary work. Don't do any ordinary work. Present food offerings to the Lord. Present food offerings to the Lord. You think they got it? Not just these verses. Now look out for repeated words here. So, these are the appointed feasts of the Lord. There's 3 of them, which you shall proclaim as times of holy convocation, for presenting to the Lord food offerings, burnt offerings, and grain offerings, and sacrifices and drink offerings, each on its proper day. Now these offerings here in verse 37 are above and beyond your normal offerings that you would do throughout the year. And he says, do these besides the Lord's Sabbaths, besides the gifts that you preside to the Lord, besides your vow offerings, and besides your free will offerings, which you give to the Lord. So the offerings during these 3 appointed feasts of the Lord's are in addition to the normal offerings that you are presenting throughout the year. Feast of Booths, not a time to be sad. Thou shalt not be sad. It's a time to celebrate, a time to rejoice, a time to be joyful. See how many times you see these words mentioned. On the 15th day of the 7th month, when you have gathered in the produce of your land, you shall celebrate the feast of the Lord for 7 days. Now, when would they be doing this? When would they be gathering in the feast of the land, the produce? They're doing it now, but the produce of the land is what? Manna. So would you be presenting manna as an offering to the Lord? So no, this is after you have crossed the Jordan and have gone into the land and received the produce of the land. And we know from reading Joshua that the time they'd entered the land, they'd have all the good rain. And when they went there, the produce that they hadn't planted, the produce they hadn't taken care of, they got that produce that the Canaanites had worked on. So you shall celebrate the feast of the Lord for 7 days. On the first day will be a day of solemn rest. Remember, we called that Sabbath, solemn rest. And on the 8th day shall be a day of solemn rest. So it's 7 days, but it actually goes on for 8 days. Solemn rest on the first day, solemn rest on the 8th day. And you shall take on the first day the fruit of splendid trees, branches of palm trees, and boughs of leafy trees, and willows of the brook, and you shall rejoice from the Lord your God. How many days? 7 days. Think if we left here and we didn't have that, and I said, how many days would you know? 7 days, right? So this fruit of splendid trees, that doesn't necessarily mean fruit. The only fruit that would be on trees at this time would be like olives and dates. But the word can mean whatever the tree produces. The leaves, the boughs, the branches. And then we're going to look at Nehemiah later in the lesson. And then Nehemiah explains that's when they actually carried it out. And we'll see what this fruit of the trees is. You shall celebrate. Here's a repetition. You shall celebrate it as a feast to the Lord for 7 days in the year. It is a statute forever throughout your generation. So keep on doing this. You shall celebrate it in the 7th month. This month is a busy month for celebration. We have the Feast of Trumpets on the first day. We have the Day of Atonement on the 10th day. And then the Feast of Booths or Feast of Tabernacles on the 15th day. Okay, you shall dwell in booths for 7 days. or tents. All native Israelites shall dwell in booths. So it sounds like it's only Israelites, but if we look in other passages, sojourners can also celebrate the Feast of Booths. But if you think about it, it's commemorating them living in the wilderness, and it was primarily native Israelites that were doing this, although Scripture says, there were some others, sometimes it's called the rabble, that went out with them into the wilderness, that left Egypt along with them. That your generations may know that I made the people of Israel dwell in booths when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Now that statement there, I am the Lord your God, he often states that when he's giving them commands, either at the beginning or at the end. Think of what they asked Jesus. By what authority do you do these things? God is telling them what his authority is. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of slavery. I brought you out of the land of Egypt. That is my authority. I am the Lord your God.
That's what riled up the crowd against Jesus, because he used two words, I am. Before
I am.
Abraham was, I am. That really got them upset.
Yeah. And then when we asked him what authority, and he answers their question with a question. Says, John's baptism, was it from God or was it from heaven? They wouldn't answer. They thought it over. Well, if we say one thing, then he'll do this. If we say another thing, then he'll do that. So they wouldn't answer. They knew the answer, but they wouldn't answer. So Feast of Booths, offerings. What were these offerings? They're enumerated in Numbers 29, 13 to 38. So that's about, 27 verses there. And there's a lot of repetition there. It just goes over what these offerings were. Day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4. And so it goes through the offerings on all the days. And these offerings included bulls, rams, lambs, goats, grain offerings mixed with fine flour and mixed with oil. And these offerings and these verses here, what they do, it goes through each of the days and tells what the offering were. And you do the most offerings on day 1, and then the least offerings on day 8. And then here's just one of the things. For bulls, day 1, offer 13 bulls. And then you count down day 1, 13, day 2, 12. You go down to day 7, and then you have 7 bulls. And then on the last day, it's only 1 bull. So that's what's in those verses. So I said we're going to cover Nehemiah, Feast of Booths. So this is actually when they've been in the land, they've actually been in exile, and they've come back from exile. And they're going to celebrate the Feast of Booths. And this will be the first time it's been celebrated, believe it or not, in 1,000 years. God said keep it forever. They did not do a good job on that. So, here's our little diagram here. We're going to look at Zechariah first. This is when the Edict of Cyrus was right in here, when they released about 539, 538 BC. And then here's Nehemiah and Ezra. So they're back here at the end of the Old Testament period, about the time of Malachi. Now Zechariah, Joel, and Daniel are the 3 apocryphal books in the Old Testament. And Zechariah has some interesting passages here. This is Zechariah this is the last chapter of Zechariah. The Lord is doing something interesting here with his people. He says, I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle. So the Lord is calling all the nations to go to battle against his people in Jerusalem. And the city shall be taken, and the houses shall be plundered, and the women raped. Half of the city shall go into exile, but the rest of the people shall not be cut off from the city. Then the Lord will go out and fight against those nations as when he fights on the day of the battle. That's kind of interesting. The Lord comes down on the Mount of Olives. Remember, that's where he ascended. He's got 1 foot here, and the mountain splits in 2. And the people go out through the passage. What does that remind you of? the Red Sea. He parts the Mount of Olives, and they go out that way. And of course, they're victorious. The Lord defeats them, and then he becomes the Lord of all the nations. Everyone who survives of all the nations that have come against Jerusalem shall go up year after year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to what? Keep the Feast of Booths. Keep the feast. All nations now have to come, not just Israel. All nations. And what if you don't come? You don't get any rain. You get plagues. Your face is going to melt. Think of Raiders of the Lost Ark. Actually, your eyes are going to pop out. It's in there. Read it. Read Zechariah 14. So Nehemiah, let's go to Nehemiah now. Ezra reads the law. And all the people gathered as one man into the square before the water gate, and they told Ezra the scribe to bring the book of the law of Moses that the Lord had commanded Israel. We're talking about Leviticus and Deuteronomy are the primary books, but most of the law is in Leviticus. So Ezra the priest brought the law before the assembly, both men and women, and all who could understand what they heard. All who could understand what they heard. We're going to find out that's children. Children who are old enough to understand. And this is on the first day of the 7th month, which we know to be the Feast of Trumpets. And he read from it. And he was up, they made a big wooden platform about 10 feet high for Ezra to get up there. And this was in the area of the temple there, the square. And he's reading from up there. He read from it facing the square before the water gate from early morning until midday. So 4, 5, 6 hours in the presence of the men and the women and the children. And the ears of all the people were attentive to the book of the law. Let's go to verse 7. The Levites helped the people to understand the law while the people remained in their places. So we got Ezra on that big podium there, and he's reading the law. And then the Levites are scattered among the crowd. And if anyone have any questions, they get with the Levite, and the Levite then will explain the passage to them. The Levites helped the people to understand the law while the people remained in their places in the square. They read from the book, from the law of God clearly, and they gave the sense, they gave the meaning of the passage so that the people understood the reading. Keep one thing in mind. The reading is in Hebrew. These people have been in Babylonian exile, Aramaic. So maybe there might have been a little language difficulty. And Nehemiah, who was the governor, and Ezra the priest and scribe, and the Levites who taught the people. So we get an understanding here. The Levites at this time, you might call them the Pharisees of this time. During New Testament times, it's the Pharisees who did most of the teaching. But the Levites who taught the people said to the people, "This day is holy to the Lord your God. Do not mourn or weep." Imperative. Don't mourn, don't weep on this day, because it is holy. For all the people were crying as they heard the words of the law. Think of the song, "I love to tell the story. For those who know it best seem hungering and thirsting to learn it like the rest." So these people were just emotional. They were weeping for joy to be able to hear this after so long. Then he said to the people, "Go your way, eat the fat, drink the sweet wine, and send portions to anyone who has nothing ready. Eat, drink, and be merry. For this day is holy to our Lord." If it's holy to the Lord, it should be holy to you. "And do not be grieved, for the joy of the Lord is your strength." So do not weep, do not mourn, do not be grieved. Sort of three similar words there. So the Levites calmed all the people, saying, "Be quiet, for this day is holy. Do not be grieved." And all the people went their way to eat and to drink. Don't you feel a little sorry for these people? They have to go eat and drink. They went to eat and drink and to send portions and to make great rejoicing. Why? Because they had understood the words that were declared to them. So this is the first time I think we'll read about having the passage read to you and then having commentary on it.
Yes.
What it means in a language that they could understand. These Levites had returned with these people from Babylon. They had a problem at first. Cyrus gave this edict and said, as many people want to return, you can return. You don't have to return, but you can. And they did a sort of a census of how many, and we don't have enough Levites. So they made sure they had enough Levites.
Their job was to be the explainers of the law, to put it into as plain a language as possible. Jesus talked about, for instance, the Pharisees having the key of knowledge, in other words, to open up the law to the people and to make it understandable.
Yeah.
And they failed.
They were more interested in keeping their power in the traditions of the elders. So they made great rejoicing. Why? Because they understood the words that had been declared to them because of the Levites. The joy of understanding. Acts 8:29. And the Holy Spirit said to Philip, go over and join this chariot, this Ethiopian. So Philip ran to him and heard him reading Isaiah the prophet and asked. So this Ethiopian eunuch could read Isaiah. And he says, do you understand what you're reading? And he said, how can I unless someone guides me? He's reading, but those were just words to him. He didn't even know, who's this passage about, himself, or is it about somebody else? Then Philip opened his mouth, and beginning with this scripture, he told him the good news about Jesus. So Philip here is acting the part that the Levites were doing. He had the word, he could read the word, but he couldn't understand it. And when so he read, he knew he needed to be baptized, so they went down to the water and got baptized. And when they came up out of the water, the Spirit of the Lord carried Philip away, and the eunuch saw him no more. And we went on his way, what? Rejoicing. Why was he rejoicing? Because Philip had opened the word to him. He now understood what he was reading.
Isn't that what Jesus did for his disciples? Right? In particular, Luke 24, 2 men, then his disciples, and he opened up the scriptures to them that they could have a better understanding.
Yes. The two disciples on the way to Emmaus. Okay, Feast of Booths celebrated. This is Nehemiah 8:13. And on the second day of this gathering, the heads of the fathers' houses of all the people with the priests and the Levites came together to Ezra the scribe in order to study the words of the law. So they've heard them, they've had them explain, now they're wanting to study. And they found it written in the law that the Lord had commanded by Moses that the people of Israel should dwell in booths. This is found in Leviticus chapter 23. Of course, they didn't have chapters then. Should dwell in booths during the feast of the 7th month. And they should proclaim it and publish it, throughout the land and the towns in Jerusalem. Go out to the hills and bring branches of olive, wild olive, myrtle, palm, and other leafy trees to make booths, as it is written. So apparently there was not actually any fruit, but it's items that you get from these trees. So I guess most of the olive is a fruit, wild olive. I don't know about myrtle, the rest of them. So the people went out and brought them and made booths for themselves, each on his roof, and in their courts, and in the courts of the house, and in the square at the water gate, and at the square at the gate of Ephraim. So where did they make these? They didn't have to go out to the wilderness. Do it at home. They didn't have to travel for it. They did have to gather these, and then they made these booths where they lived. and all the assembly of those who had returned from the captivity in Babylon made booths and lived in booths. Now this captivity in Babylon, remember, first they were taken into Assyrian captivity, but then the Babylonians took over Assyria, and then we have the Medo-Persians. So all those people that have been taken into Assyrian captivity, but that was longer ago, they could also come back. And maybe some of them did. Remember when they brought Jesus to the temple? Anna, she was from the tribe of Asher. That was one of the 10 northern tribes. And all the assembly of those who had returned from the captivity made booths and lived in booths now listen to this, from the days of Yeshua, the son of Nun, to that day, the people of Israel had not done so. That surprised you?
Yes.
1,000 years. Saul didn't do it. David, a man after God's own heart, they didn't celebrate the Feast of Booths. Solomon, all those people. Seems like they would have known. And there was great rejoicing because they had done this. And day by day, from the first day to the last day, from the first day of the feast to the last day, that's the 8th day, he read from the book of the law of God. They kept the feast 7 days, and on the 8th day there was a solemn assembly according to the rule there in the book of the law, Leviticus. A time to read the law. They did this, but they were also keeping the law by doing this. We're going to go to Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 31, 9 through 11. Deuteronomy, the last book of the Pentateuch. The difference between this and Leviticus and Numbers, we're about 2 months from them crossing the river. Those people that had heard the words there in Leviticus and Numbers, they're gone. Most of them are gone. Those that were over age of 20,
The
first generation is gone. So he's repeating these words to this new generations because they're getting ready to execute these words. Then Moses wrote this law and gave it to the priests, the sons of Levi, who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and to all the elders of Israel. Now these sons of Levi, these are the Levites. These are the Levites. At the end, and Moses commanded them, at the end of every 7 years, at the set time in the year of release, at the Feast of Booths, when all Israel comes to appear before the Lord your God, because that's a commandment, this is one of the 3 feasts, comes to appear before the Lord your God at the place that he will choose, Jerusalem, you shall read this law before all Israel in their hearing. Who? The Levites. And of course, Ezra, being a priest and a scribe, would be a Levite. Assemble the people, men, women, and little ones. Men, women, and all those who could understand. That's the little ones. And the sojourner. So not just the native born, but the sojourner within your towns, that they may hear and learn to fear the Lord your God, and be careful to do all the words of this law, that their children who have not known it may hear and learn to fear the Lord your God. So this is important not only for men and women, but the next generation, the children, as long as you live in the land that you are going over the Jordan to possess. So, okay, let's go to the New Testament. Jesus and the first of booths. John chapter 7. Remember what happens in chapter 6? Starts with, he had a great crowd. Then he gives them this difficult teaching. Unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you can't have any part of me. And then at the end of chapter, he loses a lot of people. He says, will you leave also? Peter says, where will we go? You have the words of life. So that had just happened. Feast of Booths, John chapter 7, next chapter. Okay, after this, Jesus went about in Galilee. He would not go about in Judea because the Jews were seeking to kill him, to stone him. Now the Jews' Feast of Booths was at hand, so his brothers said to him, this is his half-brothers, leave here and go to Judea, that your disciples may see the works you are doing. For no one works in secret if he seeks to be known openly, And if you do these things, show yourself to the world, for not even his brothers believed him. How well did they know their brother? How well did they know him? Now, when Jesus did a miracle, did he tell, hey, everybody, did you see this? Go tell everyone. He doesn't do that. The only one he told to tell people was the man, formerly Legion. He told them to go and do it, but then he was living on the other side of the Sea of Galilee.
He sent him as kind of like an evangelist.
Yeah, an emissary. But after the brothers had gone up to the feast, they think he's staying at home in Galilee. Then he also went up, not publicly, but in private. The Jews that were looking for him at the feast say, where is he? So they were expecting him. This is a time when Jews are supposed to be there. And there was much muttering about him among the people. While some said he's a good man, others said, no, he is leading the people astray. Yet for fear of the Jews, no one spoke openly of him. What would the Jews do? Why did they fear the Jews? What could the Jews do? The Jews had already agreed that if anyone should confess Jesus to be Christ, he was to be put out of the synagogue.
They'd have their membership to the synagogue canceled.
Yes, and synagogue was not only religious, that was a community center. That's where your children learned. So that's a big deal, being put out of the synagogue. Remember the man that was born blind? They asked the parents, what about, they didn't want to answer because they didn't want to be put out of the synagogue. About the middle of the feast, fourth day or so, Jesus went up into the temple and began teaching. Okay, well, he's not going to be in private anymore. The Jews therefore marveled, saying, how is this man has this learning when he has never studied? Reminds you a little bit of the end of the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus had finished these sayings. The crowds were astonished at his teaching. So, Feast of Booths. Celebrate, rejoice, be altogether joyful. This is the fun part of the class. Jesus fulfills the imagery of the Feast of Booths. The water ceremony, the fire ceremony. This is from the Lexham Geographic Commentary. There was no Mosaic law requiring water libations during the Feast of Tabernacles, but by the Second Temple period, this is Temple of Zerubbabel, Temple of Herod, a water ceremony was incorporated as a significant component of the festal celebrations. This ceremony helped the people to be mindful of their dependence on the rainfall in the coming year. And the ceremony was accompanied by prayers for agricultural blessings. Remember, this is the Feast of Ingathering. Their agricultural year is over. They're getting ready for the next agricultural year. Crowds watched as the priest drew water from the pool of Siloam and proceeded up the road to the temple and to the ramp of the sacrificial altar. The joyful celebrations included music from trumpets and flutes that accompanied the crowds as they sang songs and as the priest poured the water that he had collected on the altar. Prayers that God would provide the early and later rains accompanied the water ceremony. Water ceremony. Water gives life to people and to crops. Without it, you have drought. Water ceremony day. What did Jesus say? On the last day of the feast, the great day, Jesus stood up and cried. Can you imagine him saying this right after the water ceremony? If anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as the scripture has said, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water. So can you imagine the power of this statement aligning with that water ceremony that happened during the Feast of Booths and only during the Feast of Booths? The fire ceremony, night. What fire provides what? Heat. Heat to keep you warm, heat to cook your food. Also at night, what does fire provide? Light. Your lamps, you light your lamp. They didn't have electricity, light. So this will really go good with what I'm going to be reading. Again, Jesus spoke to them saying, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. So these two sayings really add, there's more meaning to them if you know the background with the Feast of Booths. the fire ceremony, and torch dance. So here's a model of Jerusalem. And this takes place right in here, the court of the women. Now here's a different depiction of it, and if you have the ESV Study Bible, very good study Bible, page 1950 and 1951. It gives the size of the Feast of Court right there. It's hard to read, 233 foot square. That works out to be 1.25 acres. And it was capable of, you wouldn't think it, but capable of holding 6,000 people. That's a large crowd. And what you didn't see on the last one were these structures right in here. What are these things here? Talks about it there. We'll zoom in on that. I can read it better here. Each of the 4 massive lampstands, 86 feet, other place says it's 50 cubits, in the court of the women, had a ladder by which to reach the 4 golden bowls and to provide lighting at night. So this fire ceremony at night, you need lighting. Here's a model of Solomon's temple. It's bright, isn't it? Josephus says the temple was built of gleaming white limestone overlaid with gold. They spared no expense on this thing. So bright was its appearance when the sun rose. So east is over here, so the sunshine is coming that way in the morning. Josephus wrote that onlookers had to avert their gaze to avoid being blinded. This place was so bright. So here's a nighttime view of it. Now we're told in the Mishnah, which is Jewish writing, before time the court of women was free of buildings. It was just an open court. And afterward they surrounded it with a gallery so that the women should behold from above and the men from below, so that they should not mingle together. You certainly don't want the men and women mingling together in worship, do you? Okay, the court of the women was therefore surrounded with colonnades to keep the men and women separate. So that helps to get the 6,000 people in there if you got...
They say that the synagogues in the days of Christ, and maybe even before that, the men and women were separate.
Yeah.
And also the New Testament church may have followed that pattern for a while.
Yeah. I understand that the church at Cambridge, Kentucky had separate areas.
Correct.
That's 19th century. Okay. After the water ceremony, in the evening, everyone returns to the temple for the most interesting and joyous part of the festival, the fire ceremony and the torch dance. The ceremony took place in the court of the women. This according to Mishnah, Sukkah 5.2, 5.4. Sukkah is the tractate that deals with the Feast of Booths. The crowd assembled in the great court. Above the court, on the roof of the colonnades, galleries had been built for the women. Below the women were the areas where the men met, down there. In the center of the court, there were 4 great golden menorahs, which were set on bases that were 50 cubits high, and which blazed with such brilliance that it is said that all of Jerusalem was lit by this light. So Jerusalem was lit by this light. Jesus said the world is lit by his light. As flutes began to play, young men gathered in the center of the court, each bearing torches in their hands. And as they danced, they threw the torches high into the air and caught them again in their hands. While they danced, the Levitical musicians played harps, cymbals, trumpets, and other instruments, along with flutes, as the Levitical choirs sang the Psalms of Ascents, Psalms 120 to 134. The Sukkah records, anyone who has not seen the rejoicing of the fire ceremony in his life has never seen rejoicing. At dawn, the silver trumpets blew the signal that marked the end of the ceremony, and everyone returned home to sleep a little bit before the ceremonies began again.
Just party, party, party.
Yep. Yes. Mind you, what, New Orleans, Mardi Gras? All right, so here's a look from above. At the end of the first day of the festival, the priests and the Levites went down to the women's courtyard, and they made a major enactment of putting the women up and then the men down. And there were 4 golden candle holders there with 4 gold bowls on their tops. That's where the oil was. And 4 ladders for each of the candlesticks. I think the women actually had a better view, don't you? In the balcony. How would you like to be that guy? I think about the, we should be thankful for the people. I think Roger's one of them. Who changes the light bulbs here? Imagine climbing that ladder 75 feet high. Each of those bowls holds about a gallon. Young priests were the ones who did that. I wouldn't want to do it, but if I did, I wouldn't be wanting to wear a long robe, would you? So out of worn out undergarments, out of their underwear and girdles of the priests, they made wicks, and with them I'll read it on this one. And with them they lit the candlesticks. And there was not a courtyard in Jerusalem which was not lit up from the light of the fire ceremony.
That's an early reference to recycling.
Yes. And there was not a place in the world that was not lit up with the light of the Lord, was there? Okay, there's one looking down. So, it really lets you know, if these are 50 cubits high, they really let you know how tall. That's 120 feet. Now, of course, you go up 15 stairs here, up here through this gate of Nicanor, and then this is the area, and then this is 120 feet high. Keeping the Feast of Booths today. Here we see a man. Definitely looks like Orthodox Jew, doesn't he? And you go in Jerusalem, you don't have to go out and find these palm fronds. You can buy them there and then take them home. I did check. It's not as easy buying Christmas trees, though. I did check. No, they don't sell them. They said if you want to buy a Christmas tree in Jerusalem, you need to go Bethlehem or Tel Aviv. How's that? Remember I said you don't have to go out in the wilderness. Somebody built a booth on their balcony. That one looks nice, doesn't it? What, those lattice things like you have for your garden? And they got the palm fronds in there. That's kind of nice. And then look at that, lemonade and water.
Yes.
Now you're supposed to dwell in those booths. It looks like most of these are, though, to have a party.
I am reminded there was a practice, at least in the 1800s in America, where people would go out into the farm fields and set up something that would be reminiscent of that, and they would stay for 2 to 3 weeks.
Yeah.
And preachers would come by and preach the word to them.
I can imagine being a child at this time. This probably one of your favorite times. This and probably Hanukkah, Feast of Dedication. But you get to do this. These were not to be permanent. This would be something you make for this time frame. I know I've never been there, but Oktoberfest, Munich, they have these big booths, and they look like permanent structures, but they're taken down after Oktoberfest. All right, there's another one. Looks like a little more modest. And Roger is getting up, so I better do the last slide. All right, next quarter will be Daniel and Revelation for beginners. Gordon said he's going to do the first 2, so that means 11 classes are available.
Yes.
Come now, they're going fast, we hope, right?
Get them while they're hot.
Okay, so that would be it then.
Thank you, Warner.
All right.
This has been a great study. Thank you.
Yeah, I learned a lot on these last 4 lessons, especially this one.